This is the image they told us American weapons development would never produce in time. Not a legacy system, not a carrier-based aircraft that Iran's military planners have been studying for 30 years. Not a Tomahawk cruise missile whose flight characteristics, terminal approach angles, and countermeasure vulnerabilities the IRGC Aerospace Force has modeled with Iranian-built software on Iranian military computers in Iranian classified facilities since the first Gulf War. What the world is watching right now on satellite imagery, on the tactical feeds running into the Pentagon's operational command center, and on the radar screens of every Iranian military installation within 400 miles of the Strait of Hormuz is the first operational combat deployment of the United States Navy's conventional prompt strike system. A hypersonic glide vehicle launched from a modified Virginia-class submarine, traveling at Mach 17, capable of striking a target 2,500 miles away in under 15 minutes, and possessing a terminal maneuverability profile that no existing air defense system on Earth, not Russia's S-400, not China's HQ-9, not the surviving fragments of Iran's Babur 373 has ever successfully intercepted in testing exercises or combat. It is Saturday, May 3rd, 2025, 4:22 in the morning, Gulf Standard Time, day 19 of this conflict, 2 days after the permanent naval transit corridor was established in the Strait. 36 hours after Iran's surviving fast boat elements made their first probe against the mine clearance operation, free vessels destroyed in 90 seconds by the A-10s without incident, and now, at 4:22 a.m., Iran's most capable surviving military asset, the deeply buried, hardened command and control facility outside Shiraz that has been directing the IRGC's strategic response since the April 19th strikes, destroyed its primary Tehran command center. It has just been struck by a weapon that Iran's best engineers assessed 18 months ago in a classified study that Western intelligence has since recovered as theoretically impossible to intercept with existing technology. Iran wasn't ready for this. Nobody on Earth has faced this in combat before, and what its deployment tonight means for the future of warfare, for the balance of power in the Persian Gulf, and for every nation currently building underground military infrastructure on the assumption that depth equals survival, changes the strategic calculus of the 21st century in ways that will not be fully understood for years. Buckle up. The conventional prompt strike is not the end of this conflict. It is the beginning of a new era in how wars are decided. To understand the specific operational and strategic significance of what the United States Navy just did at 4:22 a.m. and why its deployment represents something categorically different from every weapon system employed in the preceding 19 days of this conflict, you have to understand the precise capability gap that the conventional prompt strike fills in the American weapons inventory and why that gap has been the central vulnerability in American power projection doctrine since the end of the Cold War. Here's what you need to understand. The United States military has for 30 years possessed overwhelming conventional strike capability against targets that are above ground or shallowly buried. The B-2, the F-35, the Tomahawk, the JDM, all of them are optimized for targets whose locations are known, whose structures are penetrable by existing warhead designs, and whose destruction timeline is compatible with the hours or days required to plan, authorize, and execute a conventional strike package. What they cannot do, what no conventional weapon system before the conventional prompt strike could do, is strike a deeply buried, hardened target with a known location in under 15 minutes, with a weapon that arrives faster than any early warning system can process its launch, detection, and transmit evacuation orders to the facility's occupants. The IRGC command facility outside Shiraz had been operating with impunity since the April 19th strikes for a specific reason: its reinforced concrete construction, its depth below the Zagros mountain rock, and the certainty of its commanders that American strike planners would require 4 to 6 hours of mission preparation between the decision to strike and weapons impact, 4 to 6 hours during which facility personnel could disperse to secondary command nodes, sensitive intelligence material could be evacuated, and the command function could migrate to backup locations. Conventional prompt strike eliminates that window entirely. From submarine launch to impact, 14 minutes and 31 seconds, the Shiraz facility's occupants had no warning, and they had no time to disperse. The weapon they were told was theoretical arrived before the theoretical became operational. Their planning models. But here's the catch, and it is a catch whose implications extend well beyond tonight's specific target and tonight's specific conflict. reaching into the strategic calculations of every nuclear armed state on Earth in ways that the administration's operational planners are either fully aware of or should be urgently briefed on. The conventional prompt strike system is a hypersonic weapon launched from a submarine. It is a hypersonic weapon launched from a submarine that travels at speeds and along trajectories that are, in their early flight phases, indistinguishable from a ballistic missile launch. Specifically, from a submarine-launched ballistic missile carrying a nuclear warhead, Russia's nuclear early warning system, China's nuclear early warning system, both are now at 4:22 a.m. Gulf Standard Time, processing a hypersonic launch from an American submarine in the Arabian Sea. Both systems have, in the past 19 days of this conflict, been operating at elevated readiness levels. Both systems are designed, when they detect a submarine-launched hypersonic trajectory, to generate an immediate alert to their nuclear command authorities. The question, the specific terrifying question that the arms control community has been warning about since the conventional prompt strike program was first publicly disclosed in 2020, is whether Russia's or China's nuclear command authority receives that alert at 4:22 a.m. and has sufficient situational awareness, sufficient confidence in their trajectory analysis, and sufficient institutional restraint to correctly assess the launch as a conventional strike on Iran rather than the opening salvo of a nuclear first strike. The flight time to Moscow is approximately 18 minutes. The flight time to Beijing is approximately 19 minutes. The decision window, the interval between alert receipt and the point at which a retaliatory launch decision must be made to be meaningful, is, by the logic of nuclear deterrence theory, approximately the same duration. The conventional prompt strike took 14 minutes and 31 seconds to reach Shiraz. The margin between correct attribution and catastrophic miscalculation tonight is measured in minutes, and in the quality of the 4:22 a.m. shift supervisor in two specific underground facilities in Russia and China. The immediate crisis picture at 4:22 a.m. today carries a density and a category of risk that no previous moment in this 19-day conflict has presented. We are talking about the direct launch notification protocols that the United States is obligated under the terms of the New START Treaty framework, now formally expired, but whose risk reduction mechanisms both parties have informally continued to observe, to transmit to Russian nuclear command authorities within minutes of any submarine-launched hypersonic strike. Sources confirm that the notification was transmitted through the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center hotline at 4:19 a.m., 3 minutes before the weapon impacted, as required by the informal continuing protocol. Russia's confirmation of receipt has not yet been publicly acknowledged, and we are talking about the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which issued a statement at 5 a.m. Beijing time describing the launch as a dangerous escalation that China views with the utmost gravity, and specifically calling for immediate clarification of the weapon system employed, language that indicates China's early warning system detected the launch and that Beijing requires confirmation it was conventional rather than nuclear before standing down its elevated alert posture. We are talking about the Persian Gulf financial markets, which have not yet opened, but whose overnight futures trading has pushed oil back above $190 as market participants price in the deployment of a previously untested hypersonic strike system as an indicator that the conflict's intensity is accelerating rather than resolving. We are talking about the U.S. Congress, which was notified of the strike at 4:45 a.m. in calls from the National Security Advisor to the four congressional leaders, calls that sources say were received with a range of reactions from supportive to deeply alarmed about the nuclear attribution risk. And we are talking about the conventional prompt strike specific target, the Shiraz Command Facility, whose destruction removes the last known IRGC strategic command node from the operational picture and leaves Iran's surviving military elements operating without centralized direction for the first time in the conflict. The decision timeline that produced the 4:22 a.m. launch is a study in the specific compression that 19 days of continuous crisis operations produce in decision-making structures that were designed for deliberative function. The authorization chain for conventional prompt strike is, by law and by operational protocol, more restrictive than that for conventional strikes. The nuclear ambiguity risk requires presidential authorization that cannot be pre-delegated to theater commanders, and it requires a specific legal finding that the target's military value and the operational necessity of a prompt strike justify the strategic risks of hypersonic employment. The president signed that finding at 11:17 p.m. Friday. according to sources familiar with the authorization document. The finding was transmitted to the submarine's commanding officer at 12:03 a.m. Saturday. The commanding officer conducted a crew readiness check and a targeting data verification at 1:45 a.m. He requested and received final launch authority at 3:58 a.m. The weapon was away at 4:07 a.m. Gulf Standard Time, it impacted at 4:22 a.m. The specific reason the strike was authorized at this moment rather than earlier in the conflict is not tactical, it is intelligence-driven. And sources familiar with the targeting decision say that a human asset, a human intelligence source inside or with direct access to the Shiraz facility, provided the confirmation received in the previous 72 hours that the facility's full IRGC strategic command complement was present and operations, including the Qudus Force Regional Operations Director and the IRGC Aerospace Force's Surviving Missile Program leadership. The conventional prompt strike was not deployed because no other weapon could reach the target. It was deployed because no other weapon could reach the target before its occupants had time to leave. It gets worse along the specific dimension that connects tonight's hypersonic deployment to the long-term strategic stability of the Persian Gulf security architecture. The permanent corridor is designed to establish. The conventional prompt strike's combat debut does not merely announce a new American capability. It announces the obsolescence of a specific class of Iranian strategic investment. Since the early 2000s, Iran has invested an estimated $12 billion in hardened underground military infrastructure, command facilities, missile storage bunkers, weapons production plants, command and control nodes specifically designed to be invulnerable to American conventional strike capability on the assumption that warning time and dispersal protocols would protect their occupants even if the facilities themselves were eventually destroyed. That $12 billion strategic investment, validated by 20 years of American conventional strikes that always allowed enough warning time for dispersal to work, was rendered obsolete at 4:22 a.m. this morning. But here is the second-order consequence that matters beyond Iran specifically. North Korea has invested an estimated $4 billion in comparable underground military infrastructure designed on identical assumptions. China has invested far more. The People's Liberation Army's underground Great Wall project, which involves hundreds of tunnels and hardened facilities throughout China's interior, is estimated by U.S. intelligence agencies to represent over $100 billion in strategic hardening investment. So Russia's underground command infrastructure, the so-called deep underground facilities that intelligence agencies have tracked since the Cold War, represents the single largest investment in underground military hardening in human history. All of it was built on the same assumption the IRGC built its Shiraz facility on, that warning, time, and dispersal protocols are a viable substitute for invulnerability. As of 4:22 a.m. this morning, that assumption is no longer valid. The conventional prompt strike does not merely change the Iranian military calculus, it changes the Pyongyang calculus, the Beijing calculus, the Moscow calculus. It changes every strategic plan built on the architecture of depth and warning time as the primary defense against American conventional strike. Whether that change makes the world more stable or less stable is a question whose answer will emerge over years. And what is certain is that it will produce a response in hardening, in dispersal, in countermeasure development, and potentially in the acceleration of capabilities designed to hold American assets at its equivalent, the risk that the administration's operational planners cannot control and that this morning's strike did not prevent. Nobody is fully analyzing the human dimension of the Shiraz strike and what it reveals about the intelligence operation that made tonight's deployment possible, because the revelation itself that the United States had a human source with access to the IRGC's most secure surviving command facility will have consequences for American intelligence operations in Iran that extend years beyond this conflict. The existence of a human asset at that level of access is the most closely guarded intelligence secret of the entire 19-day conflict. Its disclosure, which is implicit in any public discussion of how the targeting decision was made and why it was made, when it was made, will initiate an IRGC counterintelligence sweep of every individual with access to the Shiraz facility in the weeks and months preceding the strike. Sources familiar with Iranian counterintelligence practice describe those sweeps as comprehensive, methodical, and lethal in their consequences for anyone who cannot definitively account for their access to and movements around secured facilities. The operational decision to employ conventional prompt strike on the basis of a human product was, by definition, a decision to burn the asset that produced the intelligence, because the strike's precision and timing will make the source's existence apparent to any competent counterintelligence service. The trade a single human asset for the IRGC's strategic command complement may be the right operational trade history may judge it as such, but it is a trade that was made, and the individuals who enabled it are now exposed to consequences that the operational order signed at 11:17 p.m. Friday did not and could not fully address. The historical weight of 4:22 a.m. sits in a very specific and very uncomfortable tradition, the tradition of weapons whose combat debut transformed the strategic landscape in ways their designers and deployers did not fully anticipate. The atomic bomb's first use in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 was, from the American operational perspective, a military success of the most categorical kind. It achieved its immediate objective, shortened the war, and avoided the casualties of a home island's invasion. Its second-order consequences, the nuclear arms race, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, 60 years of nuclear proliferation, and the permanent existential shadow that the bomb has cast over every great power confrontation since 1945, were not fully anticipated by the men who authorized its use. The cruise missile's operational debut in the 1991 Gulf War announced a new era of precision conventional strike that transformed American military doctrine and triggered a global investment in countermeasures, specifically the hardened underground facilities and dispersal protocols that the conventional prompt strike is now designed to defeat, that reshaped the strategic competition for 30 years. The combat debut of the conventional prompt strike at 4:22 a.m. this morning belongs to that tradition of weapons whose arc first use is the clearest and least complicated moment in their strategic history. What follows? The countermeasures, the proliferation, the pressure, the doctrinal adaptations, the acceleration of competing hypersonic programs in Russia and China that have been underway for years, and that tonight's deployment will accelerate further, is the complicated part. The Republic has opened a door that cannot be closed. What the American Republic has authorized, executed, and revealed to the world at 4:22 a.m. on May 3, 2025, is a demonstration of military capability that simultaneously resolves the immediate tactical problem of the Shiraz command facility and opens a set of strategic questions whose full scope will not be visible for years. Alexander Hamilton, who was in many respects the founder's most clear-eyed analyst of the relationship between military capability and Republican governance, wrote in Federalist Number 28 that the means ought to be proportioned to the end, and that the persons who are to administer the government must possess the means to fulfill their obligations to the nation. The conventional prompt strike is a means, the end, a stable, commercially open Strait of Hormuz, a degraded Iranian military capability, a strategic deterrence posture that prevents future IRGC harassment campaigns, is legitimate and was constitutionally authorized. What Hamilton's framework does not address, because Hamilton could not have imagined a weapon traveling at Mach 17 and arriving before its own radar signature has been fully processed, is the question of whether means of such speed and finality are compatible with the deliberative character of Republican governance, and whether the Republic's commitment to proportionality and necessity in the use of force survives the compression of decision timelines to the point where the weapon is away before the lawyers have finished their review. The authorization process was followed. The legal finding was signed. The notification was transmitted. The Republic's formal requirements were met. Whether the Republic's deeper requirements, wisdom, restraint, full comprehension of second-order consequences, the willingness to accept a slower but less destabilizing resolution were met is the question that the history books, not the operational order, will eventually answer. Watch these 5 indicators of the next 48 hours, because they will determine whether tonight's deployment accelerates the crisis toward resolution or opens a new phase whose parameters differ fundamentally from the 19 days that preceded it. Watch Moscow and Beijing, specifically whether either government issues a formal diplomatic protest through the UN Security Council and a veto threat regarding the nuclear attribution risk of hypersonic conventional strike. employment, which would initiate a multilateral legal and arms control debate that constrains future American conventional prompt strike use, regardless of this conflict's outcome. Watch Tehran's silence. The destruction of the Shiraz Command Facility has left Iran's surviving military elements without centralized strategic direction, and the first 48 hours of that decentralization are the most dangerous. Not because Iran will launch a coordinated response, but because individual IRGC unit commanders operating without strategic oversight may take actions their command authority would have constrained, producing escalatory events that no one in the chain authorized. Watch the first commercial supertanker transit of the permanent corridor scheduled for tomorrow morning under U.S. Navy escort. The transit's completion is the operational proof of concept the corridor's strategic logic requires, and any Iranian interference with it, however improvised and however tactically insignificant, will consume political capital and media oxygen that the administration needs for the congressional supplemental appropriations and fights. Watch the Oman Channel, which sources describe as more active in the past 6 hours than at any point in the conflict. The destruction of the IRGC Strategic Command may have created the opening, and the Secretary of State has been pursuing for 19 days, not because Iran's leadership wants to negotiate, but because the leadership that was willing to resist no longer exists to direct the resistance. And watch the Meridian gas, because if the 23 crew members are released in the next 48 hours. It is not Iran conceding defeat. It is Iran's surviving civilian diplomatic apparatus, the foreign ministry, the Rouhani-era technocrats who have been sidelined by the IRGC for years, reasserting control over a crisis the military ran into the ground. Their release would be the clearest possible signal that the phase of this conflict defined by IRGC strategic autonomy is over, and that the phase defined by diplomatic reconstruction is beginning. The weapon has been fired. It cannot be unfired, and the era it has opened cannot be unopened. The Republic now manages the consequences of both in real time with imperfect intelligence, finite resources, and a scrutiny of a world that is still calculating what 4:22 a.m. on May 3rd, 2025 means for its own security. Subscribe. Stay with us. History moved faster than anyone planned for this morning. It will not slow down to accommodate the schedule.